Well, Rachel, I think you have some things to say about the moral standards of Nick versus June next.
Yes, I do. So I'm going to be referencing a couple articles, which with quotes from Elizabeth Moss, Eric Tuchman, and Yellen Chang. One of the articles is from The Wrap called "The Handmaid's Tale Cast Unpacks Nick's Shocking Episode 6 Decision. We Make Mistakes Under Duress," which was a quote from Max. And then an Us Weekly article called "Handmaid's Tale Showrunners Tease How June and Nick's Relationship Changes Ahead of Series Finale," with quotes from Eric Tuchman and Yellen Chang. So, since we saw the events unfold over episodes 606 and 607, I have been struggling with two primary thoughts. First, what happened to the women at Jezebel's was indeed tragic, but what Nick did does not come across as an actual betrayal to me. Nick did not walk into his house that night with the intention of giving the intel to Wharton. The intel was bullied out of him in a terrifying and threatening way. Also, Nick gave Wharton the rebel plan, but he had no idea the extreme measures against the women at Jezebel's that Wharton was going to take as a result. Yes, Nick gave Wharton this information to save his own life, but considering that June was still in New Bethlehem and considered a fugitive, June would have also been in trouble had Nick been arrested. And in addition, he was still working as a double agent spying for the Americans. And as he told Mark Twello in episode 603, "I'm no good to you dead." In my opinion, Nick saved more than just himself in that moment, but for the sake of argument, since Elizabeth Moss, Eric Tuchman, and Yellen Chang are trying very hard to convince the audience in multiple interviews that Nick's actions were only selfish and his act somehow revealed who he really is and where his true allegiance lies, in other words, with Gilead, for the sake of argument, let's say Nick only acted to save himself. In the Wrap article, Elizabeth Moss said, with regards to Nick's betrayal, "Absolutely not. She can't forgive him. June has done some questionable things, but she has always done it in the interest of the good guys. Nick is responsible for the deaths of these innocent women, and he didn't need to do that. And he does it to protect himself. It's unforgivable, and I think June knows that." Which brings me to the second thought I have had. How can June not understand the choice Nick made? Hasn't she done the same herself? Haven't innocent people died as a consequence of her own actions, as a consequence of choices she has made for her own survival, even for reasons that were, quite frankly, selfish and only served herself, not necessarily the good guys? I think Elizabeth Moss and June need to do a thorough rewatch of The Handmaid's Tale because it seems they've both forgotten a few things. So let's review. In season 2, episode 3, when Omar is notified that the safe house he is supposed to take June to has been compromised and he is supposed to abort his mission and leave June behind, was it not for June's own survival that June forced Omar to take her with him? Omar and his family are caught. Maybe a neighbor saw or heard June in their apartment and reported them. Maybe someone spotted June standing in their open window. Regardless of how it happened, Omar and his family are caught. Omar is executed and hung on the wall. His wife, Heather, is made a handmaid, and their son, Adam, is given to another family as a consequence of June's actions for her own self-preservation. It is also worthy to remember June has a mental breakdown after she learns what happened to Omar and his family. When Nick sees how she isn't well, he tries to get her help by asking Serena to find a doctor to treat June's mental state. After Nick begins to break himself in season 6, after what he had to do, killing the Guardians to protect June, Luke, and Moira, and after his actions unintentionally killed the women at Jezebel's, June does not treat Nick with any understanding or sensitivity or love. She suddenly only sees him as a monster. In season 3, June is responsible for the deaths of Hannah's Martha Francis and her walking partner Natalie after she makes an attempt to visit Hannah at her school. While I think the viewer always empathizes or sympathizes with the pain June goes through being separated from her daughter, and while I think we can all understand June's desire to see Hannah, even if it's only for a second, the fact remains this was a selfish act on June's part that led to the deaths of 2 people, as well as the relocation of Hannah and the Mackenzies. Hannah also tragically loses her Martha, who I am sure was loving and kind to her and who Hannah obviously loved in return, while also being separated from any friends she had made at her school. In episode 607, June says to Nick, "You gave up those women to save yourself." First of all, no, he didn't. Nick gave up the plan, unaware of what the consequences of that would be. It is very likely he felt this was safe intel to reveal because while it may kill this plan of Mayday's, they can always come up with another plan. Wharton is the one who made the decision to take such extreme actions against the women at Jezebel's. Even Nick said, I never said it was them. I never said the girls had anything to do with it. I didn't think he would do that. So Nick was cornered, and in a moment of panic and self-preservation, he made a choice that resulted in innocent women being killed as a result. This should trigger in June some sympathy and understanding for Nick's situation, as well as guilt in herself, because she has been through very close to the exact same thing herself. But since both June and Elizabeth Moss seem to have forgotten this, let's remind them. In season 3, episode 11, June also found herself cornered and in a terrifying situation herself when Commander Winslow is preparing to rape her at Jezebel's, and instead of submitting to rape one more time, June fights back, killing Winslow as a result. The Marthas do a very thorough job cleaning up after June in one of the best montages I had ever seen on the show. However, in season 4, episode 2, June learns from a woman named Daisy, who is a Jezebel at a different location, that they cleaned house at the Boston Jezebels after Winslow went missing. We don't get specific details of what that meant. However, since Daisy says she was one of the lucky ones, it is a safe assumption the other women were either killed or sent to the colonies to die slowly. We don't see this happen the way we were shown the brutality of the women being executed at Wharton's orders in 607. However, it is a safe assumption that the women at the Boston Jezebels faced extreme punishment due to June acting in her own self-preservation. This doesn't seem to teach June a lesson about how her actions can have severe consequences on others, however, as in that same episode, she immediately decides she wants to take some rebel action against the Chicago commanders who frequent this other Jezebel's location. She decides to poison them. Or should I say, June brings the poison and the women at Jezebel's do the poisoning. June walks away, feeling proud of herself, and leaves safely. However, actions always have consequences in Gilead, and there was no way the women at Jezebel's weren't going to face severe punishment after 9 commanders ended up in the hospital and 6 ended up dead, according to Commander Lawrence in 403. And speaking of season 4, episode 3, Nick spent that episode focused on doing whatever he could to keep June alive, while in season 6, episode 7, June apparently would have preferred Nick to choose death. For good measure, I will also point out that after June does withstand a fair amount of torture herself in season 4, episode 3, resisting giving up the location of her friends, she also chooses to protect her handmaid friends over Beth and Sienna, her Martha friends from Lawrence's house. And when Hannah is threatened, she eventually gives up the location of her handmaid friends anyway, similar to Nick giving up intel to save herself and her daughter. I also want to add that while Nick's actions had horrific consequences he did not intend, Nick also had the decency to be devastated by this outcome. I applaud Max Minghell's acting in the scene after June and Nick first exit the closet at the beginning of season 6, episode 7. The raw anguish and guilt on his face and in his voice was gut-wrenching. Nick was blindsided by Wharton's choice. Yes, Nick acted to save himself, but he didn't realize how severe the consequences would be. Meanwhile, after all the examples I have gone through of severe consequences and lives lost due to June's actions over and over again, the only time we see her experience true remorse is when she learns what happens to Omar and his family. She looked angry at Frances when she helped execute her. She seemed gleeful in the market when Natalie has her final mental break and is shot and dragged out by guardians. She didn't seem to react much at all when she learned the fate of the women at the Boston Jezebels after she killed Winslow, even doubling down with a new plan to poison more commanders, which will ultimately hurt more women as a result. With all of these consequences of her own actions and piles of innocent victims in her own wake, June has the nerve to say to Nick, "You gave up those women to save yourself." A statement that is both factually inaccurate and unfair, as well as hypocritical given what she has been responsible for herself. My hope after watching season 6, episode 7, was that this experience with Nick would force June to do some serious self-reflection and realize that while what happened was tragic, she really is in no position to judge anyone who was unintentionally responsible for the death of others, especially because the Mayday plan that Nick revealed to Wharton most likely would have resulted in unintentional deaths anyway, had they gone through with it. The women at Jezebel's had already been considered collateral damage by the Mayday crew before June mentioned them being caught in the crossfire. Their attitude was, this is war. But now that that plan was foiled, Mayday cares about the women who died. Nick is a Nazi and June is blamed for trusting him when she has been given absolutely no reason whatsoever to not trust him. After Nick just risked his life To save Luke and Moira's lives, after he murdered 2 guardians to protect all of them, after risking his life further, working as a double agent spying for the Americans for months, why wouldn't June trust him? And why is this one action on Nick's part supposed to be enough to erase everything Nick has done to help her, protect her, comfort her, and love her and their daughter for years? How could June forget that Nick risked his life trying to get her out of Gilead twice? Nick risked his life when he stopped June from burning the letters from Jezebel's in season 2, episode 5, taking the letters himself for safekeeping. A man loyal to Gilead would have wanted to burn those letters, to destroy the evidence of contraband. But he saw them as something important and precious. We see this in his scene with Eden, when he finds the letters and he acts out of fear to ensure that letters remain safe. He risked his life when he took those letters with him to Canada, unprompted, hoping to find a way to get them out. Did June also forget how he delivered Fred, her rapist, to her practically on a silver platter for her to murder, along with all the other former handmaids? Or did June also forget when Nick gathered intel on Hannah, also unprompted, through a network of friendlies complete with current pictures of Hannah and her current location? He delivers this to her saying, "I never thought I'd give this to you in person." Well, he did this for her because he loved her. He didn't do this as a way to see her or to gain anything for himself. In the Us Weekly interview with Eric Tuchman, Eric says, while Nick has saved her many times, that's only a part of his day. The other vast majority of his time is spent as a Gilead commander, and he rose from a driver to commander, so he must have been doing something to contribute to that ascent. Yes, we saw what Nick did for his promotions. In season 2, episode 5, Nick is issued a woman as a promotion from Fred as punishment for showing his concern for June when he asked Serena to get June a mental health doctor. We also saw Nick be promoted to commander after he held Fred at gunpoint at the end of season 2 to buy June and Nicole the time they needed to get out of Gilead. And this is a quote from Yellen Chang. Nick has had many opportunities to leave and to leave with June. He's been in Canada and he has made the choice time and time again to go back to Gilead and to double down on Gilead. We saw Nick's attempt to work with Mayday at the beginning of season 2 to try to get June out while pregnant with their child. We saw what a long process that was and how incredibly dangerous it was to just try to get one person out of Gilead. Yellen Chang's quote makes it sound like it has always been easy to leave Gilead, despite how easy that has looked in season 6, which I assume is due to New Bethlehem's open trade routes. Perhaps there are less checkpoints now. But back in the day of true Gilead, I always thought the show made clear that getting out was extremely dangerous and difficult to the point of being impossible. Despite Nick saying, "I should have just driven away with you, and I should have run away with you when I had the chance," and also despite Mark Twello indicating that, as an I, Nick could have run away with June when they were at the Waterfords, I think the failed attempt to get June out illustrates how difficult to impossible something like that actually was. I have also always assumed that Nick would never be reckless with June's life. He would never make an attempt to drive off or run away with her unless he was absolutely certain there wasn't a solid plan in place that would keep her safe. In a place like Gilead, it is nearly impossible to achieve that level of certainty, and it always made sense to me why Nick mostly played it safe. Also, the time and time again that Nick has been in Canada and has returned to Gilead, let's not forget that actions have consequences in Gilead as well. In season 2, episode 9, when Nick travels with the Waterfords to Canada, he is also married to Eden back in Gilead. Had Nick chosen to defect and not return with the Waterfords, Eden would have been punished, probably questioned, and even tortured for information on Nick's whereabouts, as well as the rest of the Waterford household, including June. It is the same situation in season 4, episode 9, when Nick meets June and Nicole at the school. At that point in time, he's married to Rose, who would have been the one to face the consequences if Nick had chosen to leave. In season 5, episode 10, when Mark Twello meets Nick at the border to escort him to the hospital where June is, Nick finally makes the agreement with Twello to spy for the Americans in exchange for seeing June and ensuring that Mark will do whatever he can to keep June and Nicole safe. How was Nick supposed to leave Gilead then? The whole point was to stay in Gilead and spy for the Americans for a period of time before he will be rewarded with his freedom. Another quote from Yellen: "We felt like as storytellers, we would be dishonest if we didn't incorporate those choices that he's already made into showing what he is like and what his character's really like." She later says that now June has to really confront who Nick is since he has revealed his character, his true character, at the end of the episode. Well, if their attempt to show us what Nick is really like and what his true character is was the scene of Nick being terrified and cornered by Wharton, causing him to give up the Mayday plan in order to save himself, as well as June, by the way. This example did not show me that Nick's true allegiance is to Gilead. I only saw him react in a very human way that most people would. Since that episode has aired, the reaction from the audience overwhelmingly has been, what was he supposed to do? And it is very upsetting to me that June apparently would have preferred that Nick ended up on the wall rather than do what he did. It is so disappointing how the EPs and writers have decided to shortchange Nick's character after all the good he's done for years to just a commander. The fact that he's a commander in a dangerous place and still chooses to do good things should count for something. But it's like the EPs are trying to work a Jedi mind trick on the audience to convince us that we haven't seen Nick do good things for June and the others for 5.5 seasons, risking his life doing so multiple times, and are also trying to convince us that what we saw Nick do with Wharton was a lot worse than it actually was. Because in that moment, all I saw Nick do was have a very human moment of self-preservation and due largely to Max Mihala's extremely nuanced and layered performance. All that was revealed to me is how human and vulnerable Nick is, just like everyone else. And as I have just given many examples of, June has also been guilty of herself. It does seem as though Nick is being measured against different standards of morality next to other characters on this show, especially June, but also characters like Serena, who was a true mastermind behind Gilead and still supports many of the foundational ideals she has always believed in deep into the final season. We have also seen the violent acts that Serena has done, including initiating the violent rape of June at 9 months pregnant. Or what about Commander Lawrence, who is also a true architect of Gilead? In the end, Lawrence gets redemption as he sacrifices himself for a worthy cause. Serena gets actual forgiveness from June before she also gets redemption and a fresh start with her baby, but not Nick. As show canon only illustrates, one mistake in a moment of panic and acting in self-preservation, which unintentionally results in multiple innocent lives lost, apparently erases his entire story for 5.5 seasons and reduces him to just a commander and unworthy of forgiveness or even being remembered after his death. Done.
Standing ovation. Amazing.
Woo! Oh my God, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. It was chef's kiss on that speech.
Yay!